Okay, we'll just give a minute for attendees to kind of come rolling in, and then we can start. Okay. Hi, everyone. On behalf of RISD Students for Justice in Palestine, the RISD South Asian Students Association, and the Brown Kashmir Solidarity Movement, we want to thank you all for being here with us for our virtual panel on Palestine and Kashmir intersectional solidarity. We want to start this event with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that both RISD and Brown University are built and reside on the lands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people, and that these institutions were built by the forced labor of Black and Indigenous peoples. It's within our institution's responsibilities as academic institutions to disseminate knowledge about our institution's histories. And we want this land acknowledgement to serve as a reminder for ourselves that fighting for justice means a commitment to fighting for justice everywhere, especially since we're gathered here to talk about settler colonialism in occupied Palestine and occupied Kashmir. This panel aims to reflect on and further mobilize the solidarity between our two peoples in our continuing and indivisible struggle against ethno-nationalist, settler, colonial, racist states, and in our solidarities against forms of structural violence that we've been living under for decades and continue to endure today.
And so now we're very proud to introduce our wonderful panelists. Ather Zia is a political anthropologist, poet, short fiction writer, and a columnist. She's an associate professor of anthropology and gender studies at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley, and an author of Resisting Disappearances, Military Occupation and Women's Activism in Kashmir, which was published in June of 2019. And she's a co-editor of Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak, Resisting Occupation in Kashmir, and A Desolation Called Peace. She's published a poetry collection, The Frame, and another collection is forthcoming in 2021. Ather's ethnographic poetry on Kashmir has won an award from the Society for Humanistic Anthropology. She is the founder-editor of Kashmir Literature and the co-founder of Critical Kashmir Studies Collective, an interdisciplinary network of scholars working in the Kashmir region.
Raja Abdulhaq is a Muslim Palestinian activist, community organizer, and researcher. He is a graduate student of international affairs at Brooklyn College. Raja is currently the executive director of Majlis Ash-Shura, Islamic Leadership Council of New York. And Abdulla Moaswes is an incoming PhD student at the University of Exeter. His work revolves around the comparative and connective settler colonialisms with a focus on the colonization of Palestine and Kashmir.
Uzma Falak is pursuing her PhD in anthropology at the University of Heidelberg. Her essays, poems, and reportage have appeared in The Baffler, Warscapes, Adi Magazine, The Economic, Political Weekly, Al Jazeera, The Polis Project, The Caravan, Himal South Asian, Anthropology and Humanism, The Palestinian Chronicle, The Electronic Intifada, and anthologies of Occupation and Resistance and Gossamer, an anthropology of contemporary world poetry, among others. Her ethnographic poem, Point of Departure, won an honorable mention in the Society for Humanistic Anthropology's 2017 Ethnographic Poetry Award. Her film, Till Then the Roads Carry Her, has been screened at the Tate Modern Second Memory Studies Association Conference, the 24th European Conference in South Asian Studies, Cine Diaspora, University of Heidelberg, Karl Storkino, and then the Asian Women's Film Festival, among others.
So each of our speakers today will have around 15 to 20 minutes to speak. And after that, we'll have around a half hour left for a Q&A session. Throughout the event, you can post Q&A questions into the chat and direct them either at a particular speaker or open it generally. We're very honored and excited that each of our panelists have accepted our invitations for today. And without further ado, we'd like to invite Ather Zia to begin.
Thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me and for organizing this panel. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge that I'm currently standing ground on the territories of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Pawnee. With that due acknowledgement, I do want to start talking about Palestine and Kashmir. We are talking specifically about solidarity and looking at what's happening to Kashmir at this particular moment in context of Palestinian situation and history. So that's what my focus is going to be. I will talk a little bit about similarities, then I'll also talk a little bit about differences. And I think that's what the broad rubric is going to be. So, you know, a decade back, a friend of mine, she just mentioned that when I was talking about Kashmir and Kashmiri situation and my work, she said that Kashmir is a Palestine no one talks about. And that kind of, I mean, it didn't set the tone for me as to what Kashmir means for international audiences or international or global communities. But it did bring in this idea of what we had been thinking about back home. And I was still beginning my graduate studies. I was beginning my academic work. It kind of set a tone to thinking about Kashmir in a more global manner, especially in context of Palestine. Till then, it's not as if Palestine was unknown to me. As a Kashmiri, Palestine is what we have grown up with. It's a beacon that everyone looks towards. And it's something that we pray for at Friday congregation along with other Muslim sites when people are making the prayers. So Palestine is very much a site that's alive, that's palpable for Kashmiris. And it's always been. And now to think about the political aspect of the global or the international aspect of it, Palestine and Kashmir are the two oldest and two of the first disputes that are on the UN agenda. So last 72 years, you've seen these disputes side by side. But what's happened is that Kashmir is slowly, it went on the back burner, so to speak. I'm sorry, it's early and I haven't had my coffee fully yet. So it's kind of terrible on my throat. So that's what's been happening in the past 72 years as we see that Kashmir is slowly and slowly in the 1960s, early 1970s, it gets sidelined. Early on, it was called the Kashmir question, but then it began to be called the India and Pakistan question. But when it was registered and on the UN agenda, first and foremost, when Palestine was also put on the agenda, that was what it was called at that time. So you could kind of say that these have been running parallel and there are many, many overlaps between the two issues. But at the same time, there are many differences and we need to keep track of both of them if we are to think about solidarities, because solidarity is not only about finding similarities, but it's also working through our differences and seeing how we are different and how that can become a strength. So talking about similarities, the similarity between Palestine and Kashmir is the internationalization, especially when we think about global consciousness and thinking about the geopolitics, and also post-colonialism. Even though when we think about Kashmir and Palestine, post-colonialism is not something very concrete that has happened. We are still living in a very colonial situation, a very neo-imperialistic or even imperialistic situation. So that's where we begin from. And then when we think about differences, there are many differences. The way, especially if you think sensorially, if you think about also politically how Kashmir has been handled by India. And when I use the word handled, it's a very, very important word for Kashmiris. And Uzma here on the panel will recognize this word because that's the word that many political scientists, that many Indian politicians use when they think in terms of governing Kashmir. And handling Kashmir is, for India, is to use the politics of democracy. And when I say politics of democracy in my work, I see this as the tools of democracy or the symbolics of democracy have been used. They have been utilized and deployed in Kashmir. And that's kind of the smokescreen that was created for the rest of the world, especially. When India talks about Kashmir, it doesn't talk about the military occupation that has been de facto present inside Kashmir for the last 72 years. Instead, what it talks about is the politics inside, democracy inside Kashmir. But what we need to do as an international solidarity or international audiences or global solidarities and communities that are looking towards Kashmir and trying to understand it, we need to understand that there's never been any democracy inside Kashmir. It's always been utilization of the symbolics of democracy, especially the electoral politics. And that's what enabled India for the last 72 years to kind of, create the smokescreen of big democracy, largest democracy in South Asia. Whereas this tyranny of occupation was going on. And how did it dupe the Western audiences, especially, which wasn't the case in the early 60s or even in the 70s, but did become a reality towards mid 70s and mid 80s. And in 1989, as this was being completely sidelined, Kashmiris kind of rose to the fact, especially people who had been active for 50 years since 1947, trying to invoke the issue of Kashmir back on the international agenda through United Nations or through some sort of global mediation. So they actually, there was a group of Kashmiris who they decided to kind of like fight elections finally, so that they could talk about Kashmir issue again, because it was completely sidelined by India. And there was this group of client politicians who became strong over from 1947 to mid 1980s. And they helped India solidify Indian rule, especially the motive of electoral democracy or electoral politics. And then towards 1989, what we see is the rise of popular armed struggle. So there are a few inclinations to that struggle. One is that one faction or one section of Kashmiris, they want to accede to Pakistan. And we can talk about what Pakistan means for Kashmiris and why there is so much loyalty, emotional, affective loyalty towards Kashmir, towards Pakistan. And then a section of Kashmiris dominantly now who want independence, but which is not on the United Nations resolutions. There are resolutions towards Kashmir by the United Nations. There are 11 of them, and most of them talk about only either acceding to India or to Pakistan. But Kashmiris have always, majority of them have wanted to be as an independent nation, a sovereign democracy. That's what they were working for before 1947. There was a prominent movement which was going on before 1947, which was called Quit Kashmir, which was mainly directed towards the monarch at that time. But after 1947, the politics changes. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A. So come 1989, you have an armed resistance going on, and that kind of signposts this resurgence of Kashmiri movement, both on the armed resistance level and also on a very intellectual, very grassroots level as well. And that's what we are kind of, at this moment, that's the historic moment in Kashmir right now. So that's one part of the situation. And the other part of the situation, when we talk about Palestine and when we talk about Kashmir, Uzma will bear me out and we can talk about it more. If you walk the streets of Kashmir, on one side you will find Free Kashmir graffiti, and on the other side you will find Free Gaza, you will find Free Palestine. So that's the nature of how visceral Palestinian struggle is to Kashmiris. And I like to think in my work, I earlier sent some links which might be helpful for the panelists here, and also for the audience who might be interested. We recently co-edited a volume where we looked at Palestine and Kashmir together, the parallels and the similarities and the differences. It came out in Identities, and in there we have kind of like described all the situations that should be the genesis of this kind of thinking, where we are thinking about these parallel struggles. At the same time, it's not as if there are any tangible, let's say, collaborations happening at the moment, but I think there's greater awareness. There's always been awareness in Kashmiri people. And I contributed this article in that this journal that I co-edited, where I kind of theorized how we look at Palestine. How do we look at this situation? How do we look at this historical, the context, the dispute of Palestine, and how do we lend solidarity? So looking at what was available to me and what I have seen in my lifetime, it's more like an affective solidarity where there is this viscerality of what's been happening for the past 72 years, an acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement is kind of reiterated every Friday. That acknowledgement is reiterated every time there's a street fight where there are not only slogans for Kashmir, but also slogans for Palestine. So there's that resonance. And that's what I think through the lens of affective solidarity. And I feel that's something that I like to begin with, because we are at the moment, at this particular juncture, we're still thinking about what the solidarity will look like. And in the last 1 year, what's happened is what I call as a re-internationalization of Kashmir issue. And the reason I use the word re-internationalization is because when we think about, there's this question that's frequently asked of Kashmiri academics, writers, scholars, any kind of media creator, that what do you think about internationalization of Kashmir issue for the last 1 year? I feel like we need to set that record right, because Kashmir has always been an international issue. And it's been India's really prowess, that the global prowess that India has displayed for the last 72 years to really sideline it, to really sideline the UN resolutions, to really sideline the international voices that had always been speaking for Kashmir, and the Kashmiris who have always in all decades since 1947 and even before have been asking for sovereign as a sovereign nation. And then after 1947, they have been putting United Nations at the central of their right to self-determination. But India has really been successful in pushing that to sidelines and just putting it on the back burner. And there's a lot of politics, and there's also a lot of geopolitical formations that have been going in and out, and we should talk about them if we have time. But going back to thinking about the re-internationalization part, so we really need to know that in the last 1 year, what we have seen, or in the last 5 years, not just the 1 year, what we have seen is re-internationalization. We've kind of like seen Kashmir take center stage as the international dispute it was on an international scale. So the re-internationalization part is very, very important to me, because that goes back to the historicity. That doesn't erase anything. So I think that was one of the questions on the document, thinking a little bit about the internationalization. So what happened in the last 1 year was that what you saw, the erosion, the erasure of Kashmir's quasi-autonomy that it had with this established relationship with India that happened in 1947. Again, what we really need to know is that the relationship was, the tone of the relationship, the rubric of the relationship was set by client politicians. These were politicians who had some endorsement, and many of them were visionaries, but they were very myopic in what they did and they kind of signed off Kashmir to India at the behest of just a section of people. It was, and the people in every decade were waiting for the plebiscite, but that did not happen. Instead, what India did was it criminalized the demand for plebiscite, it criminalized the demand for independence and all kinds of, different leanings that people had. It criminalized all kinds of dissent. So at the moment, what you hear is, sometimes you hear this meshing and collating of Kashmiri resistance as terrorist movement. Then it's also what's the erroneous stereotype of Islamic terrorism, quote unquote. So you hear so much cacophony around the Kashmiri resistance, but I think what's happening in the last 1 year, what the world has really has been stunned in watching, is the spectacle of re-annexation of Kashmir. The first annexation happened by India in 1947, which it does not narrativize as that. And I think new scholars of Kashmir studies and critical Kashmir studies scholars and writers, they are kind of trying to make the world understand that this is a re-annexation that happened last year. It happened very militarily. There are already 600,000 military forces, Indian forces, government forces, and other kind of militia inside Kashmir. They sent 60,000 more, and there are more coming. So that's what you have for 8 million people. You have the ratio kind of varies because they keep changing, and there are no definite statistics for the army and the government militia inside Kashmir, but it's roughly 650 or maybe even 700,000 military and then forces, and then also you have different kinds of police, and which is also 100,000 or something like that. So you have a lot. This is considered to be one of the most militarized zones on the face of the earth. The line of control that exists between two Kashmirs, and we'll talk later about the two Kashmirs, because I'm sure that's not, that might confuse people who are just getting introduced to Kashmir. So it's one of the most militarized on the face of the earth. You can see it through the space, the line of control that that bifurcates Kashmir into two, which happened in 1947. So right now you have two Kashmirs, and the Indian administered Kashmir is the one that I'm talking about, from where you have human rights abuses and all kinds of war crimes that India has committed inside Kashmir. And from 2019, August 5th, what we see is heavy militarization. And right now, when Uzma is going to speak, she literally is speaking from a 2G internet. So they don't even have an internet. It's a text-based facility. Kashmir was under curfew for the longest time. And it was a humanitarian crisis that even Lancet took notice of. So I think that's where I will end. And that's where we are. That's the present moment. The siege has not ended. It started August 5th, it restarted. So it's kind of started from 1947, as I spoke already. Then you have the milestone of 1989 when the arms resistance breaks out. The 2000s are a time when grassroots resistance is really becoming a big thing. In 2019, India takes the autonomy away completely, unilaterally, militarily, and then clamps down. The entire region is under curfew, and internet communication, nothing. You could not reach Kashmir even if you wanted to. And international media, which was reporting on Kashmir, they were thrown out of the region. They were banned from the region. And then in March, you have the pandemic. So right now, Kashmir is under a double lockdown, so to speak. And that's the historic juncture we are at right now. So what's happening inside Kashmir, we can save that for Q&A, and also my friend Uzma will talk more. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ather, for really getting into the foundations and starting to talk about the topic, and also for the links that Ather mentioned. They've been posted in the chat for attendees to take a look at. Next, we have Raja. We'd like to invite you to take the floor.
Thank you, Assalamualaikum, everybody, and thank you for hosting this. I think as Professor Ather mentioned, I think it's essential now that we put more highlights on the issue of Kashmir, and I definitely agree. I think Kashmir, not just within the Muslim community overall, but the international community, Kashmir is not being discussed much. There are many reasons, of course. I mean, I'll leave that more to the Kashmiri voices to highlight the issues there. But when it comes to the Muslim community, I think Kashmir has been ignored for the longest time ever. And unfortunately, it has not been on the front lines of our main issues or primary issues as Muslims or as people who care about the politics in the Middle East and the Southeast Asia. However, while it's very sad what happened last year, and as we know, when the Indian government revoked Article 370, this is started to bring Kashmir back on the surface, and I think overall, I think people now are showing more interest into learning and working for the sake of Kashmir. But for me as a Palestinian and someone who was born and raised in Palestine, I mean, there are two nations that I care about the most after Palestine. And those two nations are Algeria and Kashmir. And the reason is because of what Professor Ather mentioned, is that there's so many similarities. And those similarities can be summarized in the notion of something called settler colonialism. And ironically, this week, we have in America something called Thanksgiving weekend. And as many of us know, that Thanksgiving, for the majority of the people who know about American history, is a week of genocide and not really a week of Thanksgiving. This is the week where Western colonizers came to America and committed genocide against millions of natives in order for them to establish a new land, a new colony for them. And this is a very pivotal moment in the world history, because it established or kind of theorized for the notion of settler colonialism. Whereas European colonial powers back in the day used to go and colonize different colonies around the world to benefit the metropolitan, meaning, for instance, one of the greatest, quote unquote, greatest empires in the world was the so-called Great Britain that colonized big portion of the global south. Specifically, a country like India was colonized for over 100 years. The issue was that Great Britain was colonizing the majority of these countries in the global south in order to benefit the metropolitan. And there were the majority of post-colonial scholars called that the empire on the cheap, meaning that when Great Britain used to colonize India and colonized other countries, they used to use or exploit these new colonies in order to benefit their metropolitan, in order to benefit their empire, in order for them to benefit their political and economic hegemony on the world. However, America, when it was established as a settler colonial project, it had a different aim. The aim was to create a new home for the settlers that are coming from Europe. And this is the difference between settler colonialism and direct colonialism. So settler colonialism, and I want to focus on that a little bit because I know Professor Hafsa Kanjwal wrote an article in the Washington Post in last year when the issue started happening after revoking Article 370 in August last year about the concept of establishing a settler colonial project in Kashmir. And this article highlighted how Indian forces are trying to, by revoking Article 370, are allowing Indian Hindus to move and migrate into Kashmir in order for them to establish a new settlements, and they can be integrated into the land of Kashmir. And this reminds us of what happened and what is still happening in Palestine. The concept of settler colonialism, where you have European Jews who were, of course, prosecuted in Europe for hundreds of years, as we know. They were pushed into migrating illegally to Palestine, take over, settle in specific areas in Palestine until the day of 1948 in the Nakba, what we call it in May, or what is so-called the war between Arab nations and Israel, which in essence was just the inception of the state of Israel as a settler colonial project. It's very similar in the context of Europeans migrating into a new land and then colonize that land in order for them to establish a new home for themselves away from the metropolitan. And this was what Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism, political Zionism in the late 19th century, wrote in his book, Jewish Homeland. He said that if we wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And that was the theory behind settler colonialism, the idea that in order for me to establish a Jewish homeland, I must destroy what exists there in order for me to succeed into accomplishing my mission or accomplishing my goal of establishing my own state in there. And that's in essence what this is about. So settler colonialism in opposition of direct colonialism, as we know, and direct colonialism means that you have an empire or a colonial power that sends their soldiers, sends their generals to colonize a land in order for them to send the resources and exploit it for the metropolitan, as I mentioned earlier. However, settler colonialism is about the permanent appropriation of the land versus the political and economic subordination of the indigenous population, as we see in the classic direct colonialism. So this is in essence what's happening, or what happened in Palestine. And the reason why this is very important is when we discuss the current day Israeli violence and criminal acts and mass genocide against Palestinians, we have to understand where it's coming from. These crimes that are committed against Palestinians are not coming from nowhere, and they're not coming from just incidental events. Those are structural behaviors of a settler colonial state that was established on the notion that a settler systematic invasion of the colonized land is a structure and not an incidental event. And there's a lot of settler colonial scholars like Wolf who actually say that settler colonialism destroys to replace. And that's very similar to what Theodore Herzl said in the 19th century about colonizing the land of Palestine. There's another scholar in the name of Albert Mime, who's a French scholar, and he said that racial hierarchy in settler colonialism is very important as it's the essence of maintaining a colonial system in the colonized land. And this is very evident in Kashmir, as we see when we talk about Hindutva supremacist views that Hindus are superior to everybody else. It's very similar to what Zionists did in Palestine. Before they came to Palestine, if you look at the rhetoric and the talking points of Zionist pioneers and Zionist leaders, they were directly undermining the indigenous people of Palestine. As a matter of fact, Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of Israel, he did say at one point, and I'm quoting, the British told us that there are some 100,000 Negroes, and for those there is no value. And I'm sorry I'm using that word. I'm using a direct quote about what a Zionist leader, one of the Zionist pioneers, called the people in Palestine. And the reason why he called that word, and the reason he used that word specifically, is to create an analogy between Western racism and to reflect that Western analogy and terminology on another global South land that they're going to be colonizing. And as we see later on, even as a reflection of this and as a reaction to this and as a response to this, as we know when Balfour Declaration happened in 1917, that Balfour, he was the guy in charge of the foreign, you can think about him as the foreign minister of Great Britain. He said after the Balfour Declaration that the aspirations of the 300,000 or 700,000 of non-Jews in Palestine are not important to us. So he did not even refer to Palestinians as Palestinians or as Arabs or as Muslims, or some of them are Christians and some of them are even Jews. He just called them as a negation of the Jewish settlers who came in Palestine. And that's just telling of how this racial framework was created to also justify the Zionist settler colonialism of Palestine. And this is what these scholars said, that the superior idea is very important to rationalize the ruling of the minority over the majority, or to justify and rationalize settler colonialism. And this is very similar to the concept of slavery. When we talk about slavery in America, it was very essential to create the sense of superiority of the white race over other races. And this is also evident in the French colonialism. When we talk about the 19th century French colonialism, they were the rationale behind it was the concept of civilizing mission. France was telling its own people and telling itself, and of course lying to everybody, that we're going around the world not colonizing, but to civilize these barbarics who live in the global South, who are on the border or at the gate of civilization. We need to bring them back into civilization. So this concept of superiority, or the superior idea between the ruler and the ruled, is essential in justifying colonialism, as we see in Palestine, and as we see in India, and or what we saw in India and what we see today in Kashmir. So the RSS, or the Hindutva, the racist Hindu supremacist groups, are using the same Western notions of superior ideas of white supremacy in order for them to justify and rationalize the settler colonial project in Kashmir, or the direct colonization. It depends on how you look at it, and it depends on how you analyze the situation. So this racial hierarchy in settler colonialism is very, very, very important. So this concept again of relegating Palestinians, relegating Kashmiris and Algerians to subhumans, and that follows the European civilizing mission that was established on racist, supremacist, and utilitarian principles, are essentials for the settler colonial projects to continue. Otherwise, if you don't create this concept of superiority, you cannot justify why are you going to another land in the global south to colonize it, to kill its people, and to murder 1 million people in Algeria. So these ideas are essential, and these ideas of racism and supremacy are very important for Zionist movement, and the Zionist movement, as we know, is the pillar, or was the core of where the state of Israel was created, because this idea of a Zionist movement is a supremacist political movement that followed the European racist ideologies of colonization, in order to invite European countries to support them in their settler colonial project in Palestine. As a matter of fact, if you I just want to mention that even Zionist pioneers in the late 19th centuries and early 20th century. So, for instance, someone like Leon Pinkston, he did say many times that it's impossible to establish a Jewish refuge or a Jewish homeland without the support of the colonial European government. As a matter of fact, Herzl did message Joseph Chamberlain. He was the British Secretary of State, and this is very important. He told him that I'm inviting you to create a buffer Jewish state in Palestine that will help protect the European civilization from the barbarics that live in the global south. So these notions again were used, and even later on, they were messaged that, you know, from Herzl to British officials. He told them that I'm inviting you to help make history. That we would like. You're invited to make history, and I'm quoting here, it doesn't involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor, not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is out of the way matter for you? How indeed, because it's something colonial. So even Herzl himself, the father of Zionism, the father of the modern nation state of Israel, called Israel as a colonial project, because they understood how European powers existed and how they used to manage their colonies overseas. So I wanted to really highlight that more than anything else, because I can talk about the criminal acts of Israel, I can talk about the genocide that they commit in Gaza, but without understanding the root cause of these problems, without understanding the very essence of Israel as a settler colonial project, and without linking that to what's happening in Kashmir today, it's very hard to see the similarities, and it's very hard to understand why there's a solidarity movement between Kashmir and Palestine. And in the very essence, without the fact that the majority of us on both sides are Muslims and we care for each other, besides the fact that we are in the global south and we care about each other. But what's really essential here is that we are facing the same enemy, and we are facing the same methodology of oppressing our people, oppressing the indigenous population, the subordination of the indigenous population in order for the settler colonial project to succeed on the expense of our lives. So this is very important to talk about, and very important to discuss why settler colonialism, racism, and white supremacy, and now Hindutva supremacy are all linked up, and all of them are working in the same parallel to justify and rationalize their oppression and their colonization. So I'll stop here and I'll leave room for other speakers and for Q&A, and thank you.
Thank you, Raja. Next we have Abdullah, I believe, if you'd like to go.
Yes, thank you. First of all, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel and for organizing this event, to all the bodies that were involved in organizing it. Of course, this is an excellent panel. I'm speaking alongside activists, academics, poets, even whose work I very much admire and has very much informed my own work as well, both in terms of activism and scholarship and even literature. So this is quite an honor, actually. I want to rather oddly start with South Africa, even though I know that we are talking about Palestine and Kashmir. And the reason I want to do this is because, of course, Nelson Mandela had a very famous quote, which was he said on 1997, at his speech on International Day of Solidarity with Palestinians, he said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." This quote, I think, fits in with a longer tradition of understanding the importance of fighting against settler colonialism globally. Of course, much of the modern world that we live in today was informed and was created and set up by settler colonial genocides that took place 500 years ago. Much of the systems that govern the way the world works, if we talk about racism, talk about sexism, talk about various forms of ethnic and religious supremacy, take their roots in events that took place 500 years ago with the arrival of settlers on shores that they did not belong on. And I say that they did not belong on in the sense that given their position as settlers. Raja spoke very well about the kind of difference between a settler and somebody else, between a settler and a migrant, between a settler and a visitor. And this term settler in this regard is very important. And I will talk a little bit more about this later on. The reason I start with South Africa, though, is because I want to point out that settler colonialism is interlinked with various systems with that rule, the world that we live in. It's interlinked with global capitalism, and that is a very important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about Palestine and Kashmir. And to look, by way of example, South Africa, overcame its apartheid regime around 25, 26 years ago. Yet many people, including well-known South African revolutionaries and anti-apartheid activists, will tell you that the apartheid capitalist system, which was the way in which non-whites in South Africa were oppressed before 94 and 93, was very much predicated through ownership of land, through exploitation of labor, and through the exploitation of bodies as well. Unfortunately, this still remains the case. A lot of land is still, has not been effectively redistributed. In fact, the willing seller, willing buyer program that was instituted under the ANC only led to a redistribution of about 7.5% of South African land. And the reason for this is because really the economic question was not settled. No pun intended. I just realized that I used the word settled in a different context. Israel as well is a state that has taken advantage of certain facets and features of the global capitalist system. Since the 1980s in particular, with the weakening of the USSR and the Cold War, Israel has been able to move towards this kind of like corporate-driven economy. And a corporate-driven economy requires integration into a broader global system. And being integrated into a broader global system allows even further rendering of the indigenous population, in this case the Palestinians, as disposable. So this kind of transition led to a reliance on high-tech products and Palestinian labor. So Israeli manufacturers all of a sudden are able to rely on these Palestinian subcontractors to export their processing zones. And what this meant as well, in addition to keeping in mind the kind of shock doctrine that followed, and then with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, was that Palestinians began competing with migrants for low-wage work. And this is one of the most effective ways to assert control over a population. And people who understand the history of the indigenous struggle and slavery in the United States or North America more generally, Canada cannot be let off lightly here, will understand the effect of having two marginalized groups, an indigenous marginalized group and a, so to speak, imported marginalized group, essentially vying for the same scraps. It makes the indigenous population more disposable, and it makes the remaining working underclass more desperate. And so by doing this, settler colonial control is more strongly asserted. And this requires, like I said, an integration into a global system of movement, a global system of the movement of goods, a global system of the movement of raw materials, and a global system of the movement of labor. Labor in particular here being really important. And in order to sustain this kind of integration, a state like Israel requires two main things. One is international support or recognition and protection. And the other is a global economy where the things that Israel produces are useful. And in this case, of course, there are certain things that many pro-Israel activists will highlight, like pharmaceuticals and tech. But at the same time, one of the biggest exports is systems of domination, systems of oppression, technologies of that, kind of very dangerous weaponry, very dangerous systems of surveillance that allow for a dominant group, a dominant body such as a state to monitor people in ways that are very frankly quite invasive. There is a long history, ever since going back very far back in history throughout the 20th century of Israel taking advantage of the existence of apartheid South Africa, which I already mentioned, in order to kind of generate that sort of recognition for itself and that sort of market for its own technologies of oppression. So today, if we want to talk about who are some of the people who benefit, not people, some of the states that benefit from Israeli technology, we talk about Myanmar, in which there is currently a genocide of the Rohingya. We talk about South Sudan, which is again a place that is not the best in terms of human rights. If we want to go back to the 90s, we're talking about Serbia as well, who committed the genocide against Bosniak Muslims. And if we want to come back to the present day, a very interesting trading partner is the Philippines. And the reason I say this is interesting is because Rodrigo Duterte, who's the president of the Philippines, told his staff to only buy arms from Israel. And the reason for this is because Israel has no restrictions on how those weapons are to be used as compared to other states that are also large arms sellers like the United States or Germany. And the reason I'm coming to this question of arms is because this is where my work brings in India and Kashmir. India is the largest importer of Israeli military technology in the world. In 2017, they signed a $2 billion deal. India signed a $2 billion deal with Israeli aerospace industries. This is the largest arms deal Israel has ever signed. In addition to this, certain Israeli military technology is also being manufactured in India at the moment. And this is notable because there are, as both Professor Ather and Raja have said earlier, many very visible, very clear similarities between the struggles in Palestine and in Kashmir. Of course, there are differences as well. That is always going to be the case when you're talking about two contexts. But there are also strong similarities. And not only are there similarities, but actually these are histories that are interlinked. So I don't like to think of them personally in my own work as analogous cases. I think of them as connected cases, cases that are reliant on one another. You can't really understand one without fully understanding the other if you want to talk about them in the context of what does settler colonialism do to the rest of the world. And so just as how many of the systems that we lived under for the last 500 years were shaped by the arrival of settlers on foreign lands in the 15th century and in the 16th century, I think much of what we're going to see in the next, I'm not even exaggerating when I say the next centuries, is going to be predicated on what happens to Palestinians and Kashmiris, given that we are still very visible, we are still populations that are struggling against the colonizers who we face. there are many, of course, direct links between Palestine and Kashmir as well that we can talk about. We can talk about, the fact that they were both sold out by the British in the end. We can talk about these sort of shared practices of home expropriation, of control over communications, of arbitrary arrests, detentions, demographic change, which is now a huge issue in Kashmir and has always been a huge issue in Palestine. And we can talk about the high level of militarization that exists. An interesting fact that I came across some time ago was that there is an idea, or at least a narrative, that suggests that India only really turned towards Israel in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But of course, the first communication between India and Israel took place in the 50s. An Israeli consulate was opened in Mumbai in 1953, I believe. And it was through this consulate that a lot of the legislation that allowed Israel to expropriate a lot of Palestinian-owned properties was drafted, because, of course, after partition in 1947, there were also legislation also had to be drafted that approved methods for the Indian state to seize and redistribute absentee property, so property that was left behind by people who went to Pakistan. And of course, given that there was an expulsion of several hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948, a similar kind of vehicle of expropriation needed to take place for Israel as well, because suddenly you have a lot of empty homes and a lot of empty properties. And so this is kind of an example of how there was this sort of communication that was taking place even when India professed itself to be a global leader in supporting the Palestinian cause. So just to kind of go back a little bit to the idea of what is settler colonialism. Of course, Raja spoke about this in a very kind of excellent comprehensive nature, in an excellent comprehensive sense. But I want to also kind of bring everyone's attention to a few other quotes as well that kind of explain how settler colonialism is not quite simply the settlement of people in a place. I was once in a conversation with another academic some time ago, and I told him that I study settler colonialism. He said, in what context? And I said, well, in sort of the contemporary context. And he goes, well, how far back are you going to go? And I said, well, as far back as settler colonialism goes. He says, doesn't that go all the way back to the beginning of history? And I said, well, not really, because settlement is not just movement. Settler colonialism requires certain conditions. So there's an interesting analogy that Lorenzo Veracini, who's a scholar of settler colonialism, brings, where he says, however, quote, however, if I come and say, you work for me, it's not quite the same as saying you go away. And so this is why colonialism is not settler colonialism. Both colonizers and settler colonizers move across space, both establish their ascendancy in specific locales, and while significant, the differences are still there. But again, that question of you work for me and you go away are not quite the same, right? And the reason I bring up this question of you work for me and you go away is because, and this is kind of the point that I'm going to close on, if I'm able to make it in a succinct way, is because the logics that justify settler colonialism now, interestingly enough, have looped back to the logics that justified it in the first place. So initially, settler colonialism was about capitalist expansion. But of course, the sort of push factor that propelled it and the pretext under which it took place were not the same. There's a lot of excellent scholarship out there, and if required, I can direct people to it that explains how settler colonialism emerged out of sort of the beginnings of capitalism and of capitalist expansion and expanding to different markets and different resources and things like that. But as settler colonialism became a sort of stronger global force, states started to justify it to their own populations through dehumanization. And the logics of dehumanization, ranged from religion to racism to security. It still remains security, by the way. It's still a very important one. And I mean, race and religion are also important. But security, I think, is at the moment sort of a very visible and ubiquitous one that's still kind of not been fully discredited yet. But interestingly enough, I think that we've now also moved into a space where capitalism itself is now a pretext for dehumanization. And the reason I mention this is because if you look at the kind of things that Narendra Modi and his regime were saying sort of roughly 1 year ago when Article 370 was revoked in Kashmir, and if you look at the kind of things that have been coming out of the Trump administration on Palestine, a lot of the logics through which they justify these sort of horrible mechanisms of continuing to dominate are through very capitalist and very neoliberal language. So if I can quote over here, if I can just locate my quote. Modi says that Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh have the potential to become the world's biggest tourist destinations, the biggest tourist destinations in the world. He also, states that, and there was also, I remember a while ago, a piece of news going around about the creation of like some big movie theme park as well, that many sort of big Indian businessmen have invested in. Many big Indian businessmen who are connected to the RSS, by the way, which was sort of one of the vehicles through which Hindutva is spread in India. And Modi as well said that several herbal and organic products are scattered across Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, and if they're identified and marketed in the global market, it will greatly benefit the people and the farmers of the region. Of course, this is a huge fiction that it will greatly benefit the people and the farmers, because if the land in which those minerals is expropriated, the people who are farming that land will not benefit. And we saw that in Palestine, because even after the creation of Israel, a lot of the land was still farmed by Palestinians who did not benefit from it. Basharat Shamim as well says that the BJP government stated two reasons for the revocation of Article 370 for the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act in 2019. One is the deteriorating security situation, which is, to some degrees has become a little bit discredited within scholarship. And the other is the hampered pace of development. So there's this language of development that kind of was used very strongly to justify Indian advances in Kashmir in the last year or so. And throughout this all, 1 year later, it's pretty clear for us to see that these economic factors have not really brought any benefit to the indigenous peoples of the region. In fact, many of them were seriously harmed by it, because who would have thought blackouts, lockdowns, restrictions on movement, restrictions on education, restrictions on communication, and political instability would have a negative effect on the economic lives and political lives of people. I mean, that sounds really obvious when I say it now, but it is surprising that there is still this narrative of like, oh, economic development has happened in Kashmir when it hasn't. And this kind of similar with regards to Trump's sort of so-called deal of the century. A lot of it focused on the economic side of solving the sort of supposed proverbial problem. There was the actual peace plan website that details a lot of details is a very strong word in this regard, because they were not really details. They were more just kind of like sort of corporate, sort of empty speak. Used a lot of neoliberal language. A lot of it was about opening up markets, was about promoting private sector growth, was about solving the economic question. I think Jared Kushner used the term solving the economic question before the political question. Even the part that talked about enhancing Palestinian governance focused on transforming the business environment rather than transforming any other facets of governance. And of course, that's not to mention as well the promised sort of $50 billion of investment that are meant to go into the PA or into the sort of the Palestinian supposed proto-state, if the Palestinian side were to agree to that deal. There's a great song by them called Miljardat, if anyone speaks Arabic, that talks about how Palestinians are being promised all this economic development, but in exchange for essentially their own dehumanization. There is more I can say about that, but I don't want to take too much time away from my fellow panelists and from the Q&A. So I'm going to end on that note, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Abdullah. Uzma, if you'd like to go. And then we'll have time for a Q&A. Oh, you're still muted. Yeah, there we go.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's intensely moving that I'm able to join from Kashmir and be in conversation with fellow Palestinians and allies. And I think the forging of this fellowship of resistance and love isn't only beautiful, but I think it's absolutely urgent given the times. I'll have to flag two things in the beginning. The first thing is that if you're lucky, we might be able to escape a power cut, which are becoming intensely frequent in Kashmir, especially in the winters. So much for the state's development rhetoric. And this also actually bears a direct relation to the Indian state's continued settler colonial tactics in Kashmir, by means of which it steals the resources of people and dispossesses people. And yet, in a recent video, which was actually an advertisement for a vest or a thermal, through the eyes of an Indian tourist, Kashmiris were portrayed as thieves, so a completely dehumanizing portrayal. And luck is also needed when it comes to the dogs here. There are plenty of them in Kashmir, and if you're lucky, you might be able to, escape their barking. So please excuse me in advance for both. I think much of what I wanted to say tonight has already been astutely put forward by Abdullah, Raja Abdulhaq, and Ather Zia. So I'm only going to reinforce some of these points and add to the conversation, because I do believe that repetition can be explored as an important critical liberatory practice, as opposed to, which challenges in a way the state's repetitive cycle of violence. So I might also read in the end a couple of my poems, which again I feel are which constitute these sites of urgent fellowship and resistance. First of all, I think the Indian state's stand for the Palestinian cause in the past and in the recent years is deeply questionable. Earlier, obviously, India stood for the Palestinian cause and rights. And while at the same time, it continued to build these strategic and diplomatic relations with Israel. And at the same time, of course, Indian state continued to kill, maim, torture, rape, disappear people in Kashmir. We also know that, as Abdullah pointed out, we know that India is the biggest buyer of Israeli arms. India has also been seeking expertise, counterinsurgency expertise from Israeli experts. So basically, the arms and the surveillance tactics which are being kind of experimented in Palestine, they are being kind of used in Kashmir to kill and to maim and to also crush people's resistance in Kashmir. We also know that India was supported by Israel in the 1960s and 1950s and 1970s when it was buying arms from them. And in fact, Goldie Osuri points out brilliantly in her paper, Nehru actually, in communications with the then Israeli Prime Minister Ben Gurion, stated about a covert arms deal that actually he requested that the ship in which the arms were to be conveyed to India should not display the Israeli flag. And Gurion responded, no flags, no weapons. And the weapons did arrive along with the flag of Israel. So it's really, the already existing solidarity, so to speak, between India and Israel, at least that which is portrayed, is deeply questionable. And of course, over the years, especially since 2014, Modi has openly extolled Israel for crushing Palestinian dissent, and they have kind of openly forged new relationships. And as was also pointed astutely by Abdullah, I think global capitalism remains a very important link to understand the settler colonialisms in both the places and in other places. For example, we know that Adani Global in 2018, they made ties with Elbit, which is an Israeli arms and intelligence systems manufacturer, and they basically launched a joint venture. there was something else that I wanted to quote, if I can locate that. Yeah. So in 2013, basically, the Prime Minister of Israel, when he visited India, I think it was Ariel Sharon, the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel said, and I quote, "An unwritten abstract axis has been created by Israel, India, and the US." And he said that there was this mutual interest of the three countries in making the world a secure place. Now, I think the discourse around security is very crucial here. This has emerged as a new global trend. So there's always this, it's marked by this politics of preemption. And it is also marked by this manufacturing of a constant threat. So a constant anxiety is always in circulation. And this is anchored around, obviously, Islamic terrorism. So it is therefore used to kind of delegitimize the struggles of the Palestinians, of Kashmiri people. And at the same time, it has helped to basically, this is what, this is the main anchor of the modern nationalisms, be it the Indian nationalism or any other. And this is one of the major anchors around which it is situated. And basically also a way in which, it becomes a means in which this, basically this alliance is justified. So it's around this politics of a constant threat, this constant security discourse. And of course, it becomes, and it justifies and it also fuels the arms trade. So this alliance between India, Israel, and other oppressive regimes, other capitalistic regimes, is basically anchored on this murderous drive to kill, maim, and dispossess people. So the second point that I wanted to talk about is the Indian, basically India's post-colonial status. And we now know that, it's taken many, many years of scholarship to basically make a point that Kashmir is what really haunts India's post-colonial status. And while the Indian theorists, especially in the West, have basically generated a body of post-colonial scholarship, their scholarship is absolutely haunted by the absence of Kashmir in the works that they have produced. So, and this silence of the post-colonial theorists, even when they call out, for example, the occupation of Palestine, is criminal. It is as criminal as is India's military presence in Kashmir. Because I guess words are ethical materials, they are political materials, and they can really disempower people, they can really dispossess people. And they are an important tactics of the powerful regimes, when it comes to a further, narrative control. Likewise, the civil society in India, the activists, the scholars, while they have kind of called out the occupation in Palestine, at the same time, they have absolutely ignored, so to speak, the Palestine in their backyards. So, and they have even kind of used a very disempowering terminology when it has come to Kashmir, when it comes to Kashmir. And even though they have kind of shown solidarity, it's been kind of limited. And the Kashmir question, so to speak, has always been framed in terms of, solutions would be found within the Constitution of India, and Kashmir is the integral part of India. So still the framing has been that of territorial integrity and all. So while while the Indian civil society has kind of tried to forge a solidarity with Palestine, at the same time, they continue to dehumanize the Kashmiri struggle of liberation. Of course, barring a few, there are a few people who kind of call out openly the occupation in Kashmir as well. So I think I'm now going to read a couple of my poems and then make a last point in the end. Yeah, and of course, before that, as Ather also pointed out, it's absolutely, sometimes the pictures that come from Palestine and the pictures that are from Kashmir, they are absolutely similar. And it's hard to tell which one is from where. And while there are graffiti in Kashmir which say that save Gaza, save Palestine. It was absolutely heartwarming to see a graffiti from Gaza. I think I saw it a couple of years ago, a picture from Gaza which said save Kashmir. And there have been protests in Kashmir, in the early 80s and even before that for Palestine. And people have been maimed, people have been imprisoned for these protests. And I think it also at least in 2014, I guess, it also resulted in deaths of the protesters. As one protester whom I interviewed back then said about these protests, and I quote, "Demonstrations cannot stop the killings, but it reflects our belief, shows on what side we stand." And I think that becomes very, very important, because sometimes, given our positions, we feel that we are incapacitated to, to do something. But even like these acts of solidarity are very, very important, and they should not be taken for granted. Now I'll just read a couple of my poems. This one is called Summer in Gaza. And yeah, here it goes. We are left to count again massacres, dead eyes harboring a dream, burned throats on the brink of an anthem, charred olives, faithful lips and fingers maimed. Siraj 8, Basim 10, Musa 16, Muhammad Khalaf 4, Malikia 1.5 years old, shreds. Hamad's son Ibrahim, Ghafoor's daughter Raneem. Raneem means a chant, Basim means a smile. We count again our bombed homes, skies, ours, prayers, promises, flags, trinkets, morsels, weight. We lose count again of your airstrikes, mortars, missiles, dime bombs. We count again our dreams, olives, flowers, clenched fists, our feet marching. We give birth to your destruction every time we make love. You count. This is the poem that I wrote after Israel's airstrikes over Gaza in July 2014. Another of my poems, which is called A Point of Departure, is basically from the times when I moved to Germany for my studies. And one of my first flatmates in the city of Marburg, where I was undertaking an introductory German course, was a Jordanian. I mean, she introduced herself as a Jordanian. And then one day, we were in the kitchen and I accidentally broke a cup. And she certainly turned to me and said, well, you know, I'm actually not from Jordan, I'm actually from Palestine. And then moments later, I think she broke a cup, and here we were, a Kashmiri and a Palestinian, laughing and picking up the shards of broken porcelain. And I think this poem records that very intense, powerful moment, and it kind of remained registered in my memory as very intense and moving. Upon my arrival, it rains in Frankfurt. German skies appear like a shattered mirror. I hear the church bells tolling, the ends of my headscarf flutter as a gentle wind somnambulates. That night, I dream of 3 dead telephones, and I keep wondering about the possible interpretation of my dream. Woher kommst du? My Jordanian flatmate asks me. I reply in my broken German, Ich komme aus Kashmir. I have learned well to insert that C in Kashmir every time I mention in German the country of my birth. India, she asks now. Kashmir, I insist. Pakistan, she asks. Kashmir, I repeat. Standing at the threshold of a room, Tayyib, she says politely in Arabic. Weeks later, as we stand in the kitchen and she accidentally breaks a glass jar, she reveals with a gleam in her eyes, lowering her voice, I am actually from Palestine. I am a Jordanian Palestinian, a Palestinian Jordanian. Her Arab tongue darts out Jaffa. My father is from Jaffa. The house still stands there. It has been converted to a bar now. She raises her hand in the air to sketch an invisible clothesline. But the clothesline in the yard we hear is still there. But we cannot go back. Moments later, I break a cup as it slips away from my hands accidentally. We both laugh loud in the same language as we bend to pick up the shattered glass and porcelain, tiny shards clinging to the crisscross on our palms. And now I kind of go to my third poem, which is called Palestine and Kashmir. My heart quivers like a wounded sparrow as I utter your 3-syllabic name under my native breath. In cold winter nights when my sanctuary was invaded, your cities burning ascended to heavens. Your lush olives and dreams went on asunder, our apple orchards and maples captive howled too. Beyond fortified towers of meaning, an unintelligible stutter of longing made borders porous. Palestine, Kashmir, Kashmir, Palestine, Palace, Kash, Time, Mir, monozygotic twins of our mother freedom, rocking us in history's cradle. As a 4-year-old, I learned to sing you like a rhyme in unison with my country's name. My mother treasured your olives, a keepsake of the blessed land, a relic I never touched. How does one count yearning? Decades, epochs, eons? What travels when an hour passes or a minute hand moves? Metrology is laughable, but memory isn't. Like of a child's shoe, her only trace found under the rubble of her bombed home. Weaving dreams on her spinning wheel, my grandmother invoked you in her songs. I memorized the rhyme. I call out to you, Palestine. I call out to you, Palestine. I call out to you, Palestine. My lips tremble and my heart hope settles. As ash of gutted seasons falling like snow on our similar topographies of pain. In Gaza and Gulkadal, in Haifa and Hanvor, in Sire and Sopor. In a dream, our dead children console me. A nation is beyond a country beyond nation. Sorrowfully smearing ripe olives on their faces, they whisper, will you look for us if we don't return? 1,000 rainbows tremble on my eyelids as I read their letters from heaven. Disentangling my hair fragrant with irises from your garden. My fingers paint us on maps of belonging. Fragrances trespass. And I call out to you, Palestine. I call out to you, Palestine. I call out to you, Palestine. And I think while Palestine and Kashmir, they need to strengthen the solidarity, they need to reinforce the existing solidarity. I also feel that we must need, there is an urgent need to extend it to the other dispossessed, in this brutal network where obviously like global capitalism plays a very, very important role. So we must try and extend the solidarity to, Native Americans, to Indigenous people in Australia, Canada, Black peoples, resistance, people of color, the Dalits in India, Rohingya, and we must be ready to confront our own prejudices and, work through our understandings to be able to extend this unconditional solidarity, which should be based on, an ethical political engagement. And I think it's also our responsibility that we do not, homogenize the true struggles, and we must respect, and in fact, we must consciously bring out the singularity of each struggle, because I think that's very, very important. Because I think brutalizing homogeneity is a marker of oppressive regimes. So therefore, people's solidarity should be able to consciously bring out the singularity of each struggle without kind of forge a solidarity without homogenizing the true struggles. Because I think solidarity of any form should not be taken for granted, because a major part of our struggle, I think, is also calling spade a spade. It has taken years, literally years, for Kashmiris to call the Kashmiri occupation by its name, as opposed to, say, a conflict, a proxy war, internal issue, a bilateral issue. So this acknowledgement of the crime, the necessary to sift right from wrong is very important, because narrative control, narrative warfare, I think, is real, and it has real consequences for people in flesh and bone. In the context of Kashmir, it is intensely violent and excruciating, with so much that has happened in Kashmir, and you name it, like tortures, rapes, disappearances, other forms of disposition. People still ask you, oh, but where is Kashmir exactly? And yeah, isn't India a great democracy? And oh, Gandhi is a real hero. And this also comes from critical scholars, from feminist scholars, like I remember Judith Butler extolling Gandhi for his nonviolent politics. And I think this becomes this is absolutely problematic, and this is the extent to which the narrative warfare launched by these oppressive regimes can go. And unfortunately, we live in a brutal world where we are given spurious choices. So it is either Trump or Biden, it's either BJP or Congress, it is UN or bombing in Syria. So I think our critical fellowship and solidarity should be able to question these spurious choices and basically forge a new path, path for solidarity, which will be essential in a reshaping of the world. Yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those poems too. They're really touching, really powerful. We have around like half an hour for a Q&A, and we have a question in the chat from Hafsa Kanjwal asking, BDS India doesn't expressly speak of Kashmir outside of the ambit of militarization, human rights. How do we push the Palestine Solidarity Movement to prioritize Kashmiri self-determination over and above solidarity from Indian liberals/leftists? And there's no one specific this is being asked to, so I guess anyone from the panelists who would like to speak on the subject can just go ahead and take it.
I can jump in quickly because given the fact that I've been in the Palestinian movement in the US for more than a decade. First, salam, Professor, hope you're doing okay. This is a very important question. And I think there's unfortunately in our movements, there's a lot of identity politics, a lot of biased opinion about certain things. And unfortunately, a lot of times people in the movement, specifically in the Palestinian movement, turn a blind eye on certain atrocities because the perpetrators of these atrocities sometimes have vocalized some support for the Palestinian cause. And case in point here is the issue of Syria. As you know, when Bashar al-Assad started committing genocide against his own people, a lot of people on the left, specifically in Palestine, were silent about him because he at one point supported Palestine. And nobody denies that he did support Palestine without a doubt. But given the fact that he is committing these atrocities against his own people, this is not something that we should be okay with because at one point he supported Palestine. So I definitely agree with Professor Hafsa, and I think we have to, in the same essence we are calling for BDS on Israel, we should be calling on a BDS on India. There's no question about that. And as a Palestinian activist myself, I think that's something that is, we have to, it has to become part of our movement, and we have to be very vocal about it. And one important issue is the concept of this relationship between whether it's the left or whether it's the Islamist, where we are quiet about each other because of certain political positions are really problematic. I think our vision and our moral compass should be towards the oppressed everywhere in the world. If someone is being oppressed, this is something we have to stand for, and this is something we have to support. Because when it comes to the issue of Kashmir and India, I think, as I mentioned earlier on, when we talk about settler colonialism and the importance of having the superior idea, is we really have to tackle that. We really have to fight that, and we really have to highlight it. The situation in Kashmir is not about, as Professor Ather mentioned earlier, it's not just a question of Kashmir. It's a direct colonialism. It's a direct occupation. And as Professor Hafsa, and I mentioned this early on in the talk in her article in Washington Post, that it's becoming more of a settler colonial project. So I think we have to be very vocal to explain that India is not coming to Kashmir out of just geopolitical interest. There's a racial a systematic approach to erase the Kashmiri culture, to erase the Kashmiri identity, and to erase the Kashmiri history. This is very essential. And just like in Palestine, we always highlight the Palestinian history and the Palestinian identity to fight back against Israeli occupation and Israeli colonialism. The same thing should be done in Kashmir. And this is why it's important that when we defend the Kashmiri narrative, we have to mention that the Indian racial systematic approach to erase Kashmir is the pivotal, or not the pivotal, it's the highlight of this struggle, that it has to do with Hintudva, and it has to do with racism, and we have to link it to different supremacist ideologies around the world.
I do want to jump in here if you okay, so I do want to speak to this question a little bit, and also talk, how much historicity is important. Putting Kashmir in context of history is very important for thinking about a BDS against India, and why it should have been sort of like from the word get-go, thinking about Kashmir in terms of settler colonialism, however which way it was manifesting inside Kashmir. When we look at the Kashmiri situation, again, we have to think about how successful India has been for the last 72 years in pushing this agenda of how democratic it is. which it never has been in context of Kashmir and some of its own populations in different aflame, marginalized areas. If we look at the history of 1947 itself, there have been, now when scholars and activists and writers look at Kashmir, one of the earliest pogroms that took place in 1947 in the province of Jammu, when Muslims from that province took refuge and they went to Pakistan-administered Kashmir and various parts of Pakistan, that took place in November 1947. Until very recently, people knew about that pogrom. Kashmiris especially knew about that, but the rest of the India and the rest of the world didn't even speak about it, even though it was a headline in London Times in those days. Such has been the sidelining of the Kashmiri situation, and what many journalists and writers who kind of contextualize that massacre and pogrom now, they look at it as the first Nakba after 1947. So there are, again, not to kind of make these two struggles homogeneous, but thinking about the parallels in those, in that pattern. So historicity is very important when we start thinking about Kashmir, because much of its history has been completely erased by India, and it's been given a different spin. So the narrative of democracy around India, which has been one of the pivots when we talk about Palestinian and Indian relationship, and thinking about how pivotal Nehru was, who did not want that relationship. Again, as it has been mentioned earlier, the embassy was established in 1950 itself. And the state of Israel was informally and then formally recognized in 1950. So that does speak for how tenuous this relationship is in that manner, and how invisibilizing of what Kashmiri situation is and has been for India, and how and also how contradictory the Indian narrative around Palestine and how Indian narrative around the Jewish settler colonialism is. On one hand, you have Golwalkar, the earliest proponents of RSS, which is the ideologue of the current Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. On one hand, they idealize Hitler for what he has done. And on the other hand, they eulogize the Jewish nationalism. So it's kind of like, it's very telling of how selective they can be and how dangerously selective they can be in picking up this racial superiority element and then building their nationalism upon it. And I think that is becoming very rank in Kashmir at this particular moment, but it's never been away from Kashmiri imagination. It's always been there. From 1947 onwards, Kashmiris have always been under this looming terror of settler colonialism and colonialism. And settler colonialism, when you look at what happened in Jammu, so it had happened, it took many years to kind of unfold in the manner it did in August 2019, but it has been kind of happening in different manifestations. So in that, we have to kind of look at Kashmir in different layers and through different vantages when we are looking through the vantage of India and the narrative that it has created. So that's something that we want to kind of keep in mind, the historicity and how it's not something that happened in 89. It's not something that's happening in 2019. It's exactly happening when India annexes Kashmir in 1947. And the annexation, the exact date of annexation is seen as the date of benevolence from the Indian Army for Kashmiri people, which is not the narrative that we have been mining, that people before us in Kashmir have mined. So I think that's very, very important when we are thinking about Hafsa's question, that how do we push Palestinian solidarity movement to prioritize Kashmiri self-determination over and above solidarity from Indian liberals and leftists. We do have to make them come face to face with this history that they have erased, that they do not take cognizance of. Even the liberal feminists, the way they look at Kashmiri feminists, they look at Kashmiri feminism, they look at Kashmiri gender movement, that was also made pivotal of what happened on August 2019. gender discrimination was used as one of the pivots. That's that Article 370 is creating this laboratory for patriarchy, and it's this Kashmiri patriarchy that's very pervasive and that has created this laboratory of oppression for Kashmiri women. It's very oppressive to Kashmiri women, the Article 370 and 35A. Without actually looking at its historicity, without actually looking at its the ramifications that it had on Kashmiri women. Not that because they didn't know it, but because they chose to unsee it. Because Prime Minister Modi and the other people, they made it so pivotal. They actually had people who filed court cases in the Supreme Court of India against Article 370 and 35A, saying it was discriminatory to women, when Kashmiri activists, scholars, writers, everyone was, they were crying hoarse that was not the case. You do not need to take away the autonomy. You do not need to break a state to set that right, which was just a bureaucratic measure. Not that it was any less problematic for people who were undergoing the problem. And the problem was that if a Kashmiri woman marries a non-Kashmiri, she loses her domicile status. She loses what was the citizenship of Kashmir, the permanent residency, which was not the case. And the High Court of Kashmir had already said that this is not the case. She doesn't lose the domicile. But what was happening was that her offsprings or the property rights were not clear. For that, committee was already set, and that committee was educating it case by case basis. Because of red tape, because of bureaucracy, it wasn't really able to formulate a certain plan for such cases. So that was one of the strawman arguments that was used against, and that's when the Indian feminists kind of, were very quiet, and they kind of gave their complicity was very apparent in the fact that most of the Indians at that time in 2019, they said it was okay. Like they endorsed what was being done in Kashmir, but they only were, that their only problem was that it wasn't done the way they would have wanted. But otherwise, it was completely okay for them to remove Article 370 and to remove 35A. So in that sense, what you see is the Indian liberal agenda, which really is complicit with Indian nationalism and the occupation of Kashmir, in that they only endorse the human rights violations and often taking the political the political dispute away, decontextualizing it, and presenting as if Kashmiri situation is just a human rights violation situation, which is not the case. And the other thing that I do want to point out before it becomes a little blurry, Kashmiris did not endorse Article 370. The majority of Kashmiris, except for the client politicians inside Kashmir, they did not endorse 370 because it established their relationship with India, but I think mostly because of the 35A, which protected their territorial sovereignty, which protected them against rank settler colonialism. But it doesn't mean that the settler colonialism had not already set foot inside Kashmir in 1947. And I think as we are thinking about these solidarities, as we are thinking about how to kind of prioritize Kashmir when we are thinking about the BDS India, we do need to come face to face with the erasure of Kashmiri history and how it's being made into this very kosher kind of a situation that's just probably, an internal disorder, dispute or proxy war. And also to understand what Kashmir's relationship is with Pakistan. Not just the political, but what was it before 1947? What has it been after 1947? And what is the continuing affective relationship there? Because I think you will have the genesis of how Kashmir connects to Palestine affectively, how it connects to Pakistan affectively. I think those are important linkages, and they help us see through the smokescreen of what India has created in the last 72 years.
Sorry, and just to add, a final point to that, we also need, like talking about BDS from a strategic perspective. BDS activists worldwide take our sort of heed from what is the call that's taking place on the ground. So of course, BDS in Palestine issued a call through the civil society organizations and community organizations that exist there. And we as Palestinians from our end as well, can probably stand to educate ourselves more on Kashmir also, because I do remember when the revocation of Article 370 and 35A happened, there was a statement released by BDS in Palestine that I think didn't go far enough to cover a lot of the ground that Professor Ather mentioned in her response as well. And in that regard, I think that, yeah, probably our own, sort of BDS, our own sort of BDS groups in Palestine can stand to be educated a little bit on Kashmir also. And I think the burden of that in large part falls as well on us as Palestinian activists.
I do want to add that solidarity is incremental. No solidarity appears as a concrete solidarity at the very outset. And I think that's where we have to do the work. And that's why I think for the last 5 years, we've been actively thinking about Palestine and Kashmir together as two sites. And because of the linkages that people have created over the years, because of the social media, I think so there's been a couple of things happening on that line where people have been communicating with each other. There's a blog actually devoted to Kashmiri writings that some Palestinian activists are translating, the poetry and the articles. And then there was also, when street fighting happens, there was also this exchange of how to escape from tear gas, and all of those things were happening. As Uzma mentioned earlier, there are pictures from Palestine and Kashmir coming out that are sometimes even used at the United Nations level, and they kind of get mixed up. So there is a lot of similarity there. There is a lot of resonance there. And I think that kind of seed has already been, and it's not just in these years, it's already been there. But now, because we are globally connected more and more, I think that's where we have to begin from, that it does exist, and it's a incremental solidarity. And that's how we have to look at it, not as a lacunae or lack of something.
Thank you to all of our panelists for those very considered responses. Our next question is for Ather and Uzma. As Kashmiri women, how do you explain to an Indian who believes that Kashmiri society is oppressive towards women, that you see the societal struggles of women within the patriarchal structures they live under as conjoined with the colonial oppression of Indian occupation? What is the case for intersectional, anti-patriarchal, anti-colonial liberation? And how can this discourse of intersectionality be taken out of exclusively academic spaces and be used in popular politics and advocacy?
Uzma can take it first, and then I'll pick it up.
I don't know, I did not hear the question properly because of the connection problems, but from what I could get, the question is regarding talking about patriarchy in Kashmir in relation to the resistance struggles, the resistance struggle in Kashmir. First of all, I think this has been a systematic project of especially the Indian liberals and feminists to basically propound an argument that Kashmiri women are basically stuck between the state and the oppressive Kashmiri men or the militants, therefore depriving Kashmiri women of their agency. Second, I think the Kashmiri resistance is obviously incomplete without taking into account the several interlocked forms of domination, which obviously includes patriarchy and other forms of domination or other forms of other forms of violence and other subaltern voices within Kashmir. So I think that there is no reason why these struggles should be seen as different, like the struggle against patriarchy and the struggle for liberation, Kashmir's liberation. And at the same time, it's very, very important to understand the nuances of patriarchy in Kashmir. It has to be understood as a complex product of several factors, including the military occupation in the region. So it's much more complicated and complex than it really appears. And having said that, I think Kashmiri women on the streets or protesting or actively engaging in liberatory and resistance practices is unfortunately still seen as a spectacle. And in the recent decades, when Kashmiri women started coming out of the streets, it was kind of portrayed as, oh, now Kashmiri women are finally standing up and coming out to the streets and protesting or actively engaging in the resistance politics, which is absolutely it's basically a lie. Kashmiri women have been central to Kashmir's resistance. And it's unfortunate that that I have to even say this in these words, but they have been central to Kashmir's resistance since the 1930s, when Kashmiri people were resisting against the monarch, and then of course in the subsequent years, be it the phase of armed struggle or after that or even now. So and they are taking all these fights together, and I think that is the current scholarship, the current engagement of Kashmiri women in the resistance fairs, in the struggle for liberation in Kashmir is it kind of is telling of that. Actually, it kind of really openly kind of indicates that. So yeah.
Oh, you're muted, Ather. Yeah, there we go.
Are you done? Can I jump in?
I think, yeah, I might add to the conversation after you, but yeah, I'll have to reread the question.
I posted 2 links to where I talk about my book, where I do talk about these issues in a more nuanced manner, in a more ethnographic manner, thinking about, so the question is, how do we explain to an Indian who believes that Kashmiri society is oppressive towards women, that you see societal struggles of women within the patriarchal structures they live under? So here we have to think of a couple of things. First and foremost, patriarchy exists everywhere. It's no special, it's not unique in Kashmir. But the danger in Kashmir is that patriarchy is made out to be this very unique animal that is quote unquote Islamic, that is quote unquote terrorists, and that is quote unquote very Kashmiri, because Kashmiris, earlier I think Raja Abdulhaq or Abdullah, I don't know which one of you talked about where does settler colonialism or colonialism begin from. So when Kashmiris begin to think about their colonialism and occupations, they kind of count back 500 years, but it can even go beyond that. So the reason I bring that up is that the society in Kashmir is pretty much what other societies across the world are, and it is a patriarchy. And in my work, I like to think about it as a working class patriarchy. And the links that I just sent, I do talk a little bit about that, but at the same time, the book talks about it in a more nuanced manner. So the danger in thinking about Kashmiri patriarchy is that the narrative is always, as Uzma already said, is already taken out of the hands of Kashmiri women, and it's given to usually many Indian feminists, unfortunately, in the last 30 years have produced work on this, where Kashmiri patriarchy has been made uniquely, it's been demonized to the extent that Kashmiri men now in Indian imagination are these bearded, coal-eyed men who are just terrorists. And they are not just the terrorists that are terrorizing the rest of the world and India, but they're also terrorizing their own women. And in that equation, Kashmiri women's agency is completely erased. So first and foremost, what should be happening is that India needs to come face to face with its neo-imperialist / imperialist soul. It should really, really take stock of what it is and what it has become after 1947 and even before, when it was envisaged in the colonial imagination, especially in the British colonial imagination. So I think when you kind of lift the smokescreen of the democracy that it kind of, however imperfect it might be. I know democracies are a work in progress. So I'm not saying that this has to be something very concrete. It can be a work in progress, but it cannot be as imperfect as it is at the current moment. And when Kashmiri patriarchy is demonized, we Kashmiri women do see the danger of how our social struggles against the patriarchy can be erased, and how we are fearful for Kashmiri men as well. So let me give you an example. 2 years ago, the Me Too movement happened. And when the Me Too movement happened, Kashmiri scholars, especially women scholars, we started thinking about what is it going to do to Kashmiri, the narrative around Kashmiri occupation, because when you're demonizing Kashmir, when Me Too is happening, and you have to let it happen because this is something that is bona fide, that needs to happen, and there is going to be a patriarchal section that is going to be implicated in this new movement. How do we respond to that as feminists? And how do Indian feminists respond to the Me Too happening? So we actually had to issue an alert by saying that this is not something unique, and this should not be used to demonize the Kashmiri movement, because that was the danger in that you are kind of like taking these cases and then they will be weaponized against Kashmiri movement. And that's the danger. And I think the reason I said that you have to, when you are speaking to an Indian audience, you do have to educate them regarding what India is to Kashmir. And then when that is clear, it kind of falls into place how Kashmir is always shown to the Indian masses, and now Indian masses have believed the fact that it's a proxy war from Pakistan. It's an internal dispute. They do not realize that it's a historical dispute, that historical demand that has always been there. And in that equation, Kashmiri men are uniquely demonized. And this is not to say that Kashmir is not a patriarchy. This is not to say that we don't have social issues. And as Uzma said, they are parallel structures, but at the same time, they're parallel processes. And at the same time, we also have to think about how the patriarchal military industrial complex that is at the top, how that compromises Kashmiri patriarchy, and how it also feminizes Kashmiri patriarchy, and how it also doubly makes the structure violent on Kashmiri women. And that's what Kashmiri women are dealing with at the moment. And on the other side, because Kashmir has been a working class patriarchy, because think about the unique occupations that have permeated on Kashmiri society for the last 500 years. In that, Kashmiris have always been living under indentured slavery, so to speak. And most of the Kashmiri Muslims, they did not have the wherewithal of education, either modern or medieval education. So they were typically living in very trying circumstances under heavy taxes, and they were working class. So there was a section of people who were elite and clergy, and they had women who were living under invisibilized standards, but most of the Kashmiri women were economically supplementing their society and their families, and they were living in complementary economic setup. So we do have to take that into consideration. But what is happening in India at the moment, and has been happening incrementally for the last 72 years, I've had these questions. I'm sure Uzma has had these questions. Hafsa and anyone who's a Kashmiri woman on attending this panel and on the panel, we've had this question like, where is your burqa? So all of those questions are very, very common for Kashmiri, so sometimes Kashmiri women, because it's so uniquely portrayed as this heavily patriarchal. So my question would be, so how to begin this? The beginning again begins from education. If this question is asked by an ally, I would say, come face to face with the kind of narrative you have set around the filmmakers, the writers, the media. Kashmir has always been fetishized, so to speak. Even today, as Uzma was talking about this advertisement, the commercial that's running, where they show Kashmiris as thieves. There's been an advertisement where Kashmiris are shown as these sort of like these servile people who can only gain authenticity after they've been like hospitable people to Indians. In that equation, when we see Article 370 that happened, India's colonial heart was so bare at that time, because the calls that were given out at that particular moment by many Indian politicians and Indian masses and some entertainers as well, was now that the Article 370 is gone, you can easily go and marry Kashmiri women, and they were called fair-skinned girl, which is the internalized racism that much of South Asia, especially India, has. So at that particular moment, you could see the rank misogyny and the patriarchal colonization and Indian occupation and militarization that is very, very patriarchal in nature and is very misogynistic. That was very brazen and rank in 2019, many of our friends and family who lived in Delhi at that time, they actually stopped going to their offices because they were being harassed on that pretext. Maybe it was a joke happening here or there on Twitter. Everywhere women were being harassed. So you could see the patriarchal nature of this new annexation, the re-annexation that was happening. So Kashmiri society, and this is not exoneration of Kashmiri patriarchy. I'm not saying that there is not that culpability which most patriarchies, they need to come face to face with the kind of misogyny or deep, and I'm not looking at it from the lens of presentism as well. So I'm just talking about the way it's kind of unfolding at the moment. We do need to take stock of that, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that as we are unfolding or we're trying to understand how Kashmiri patriarchy exists, we have to look at the multiple layers, especially we have to look at occupation. You know, when I was working on the disappearances, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, where women are mostly the activists, I was told about, mostly the question that I receive is, you know, what about the gendered agency? What's happening to women in Kashmir? I always try to bring attention to the fact that it's men being disappeared and then women leaving homes to search for those men. So it's not just one gender. At the moment, both genders and men are under heavy security discrimination. And it's another discussion altogether, but just to bring back the discussion that this is not a uniquely violent patriarchy, and it is complicated by military occupation, and we need to look at it through that intersectionality as well.
I think I would like to add to what Ather had to say. It's absolutely right. I mean, like I already said, that the patriarchy in Kashmir is much more complex and complicated. I mean, imagine living in a place with over like 500,000 troops, and imagine having to walk through their military bunkers and other surveillance units. So the occupation specifically is very, very gendered in Kashmir. So while, for example, the rapes of women have been openly discussed and talked about, the male sexual violence remains, you know, widely underreported. And even if it's talked about, it's often kind of talked about under the rubric of torture. So I think that's very important to understand. And while the occupation is, you know, produces gendered attacks, it's only natural that the resistance also kind of is gendered. And that is really evident in the struggles ongoing in Kashmir. But the question of patriarchy, as Ather pointed out astutely, has been used by the Indian liberals, by the Indian feminists to delegitimize the Kashmiri struggle, and it is being used as is being used the question of Kashmiri Pandits. You know, they are being used in a similar fashion to create further divides. And this is obviously not to say that patriarchy doesn't exist, and other kind of subaltern layers, whether it's the question of class, whether it's the question of gender, whether it's the question of caste. All these questions do exist in Kashmir, and people are working through these complex questions under this, obviously, this grand eye of the state, ever-present state. So it's not to say that patriarchy doesn't exist, but it exists in much more complicated forms. But it has at the same time been exploited by the Indian liberals and the Indian feminists, and also by the state. So while the state is killing and maiming and raping and disappearing people, at the same time, it has kind of started these statist, you know, empowerment programs, these feminist programs. I think recently, and obviously there is also this constant struggle to homogenize women into a singular category. Recently, there is a statist feminist group which kind of put forward a Facebook post, and basically collage of different women who have contributed, you know, in different ways. So while there were some singers, some activists, and other resistance activists in the collage, there were also women who have kind of actively aided the state occupation. So for example, in the middle of, you know, the brutal siege in Kashmir, these women who work in the bureaucracy have openly said that, oh, but nothing is, there's no problem in Kashmir. Kashmir is absolutely normal. So this statist feminist group wanted to basically create this homogeneous category of a woman without paying attention to the nuances, you know, without paying attention to what it can do. So I think that becomes very, very important to understand the forms of these so-called, rescue feminists, or, who are kind of suffering from some savior complex. I think, and of course, at the same time, calling out these statist empowerment schemes, which have majorly been very, very exploitative in nature. And yeah, having said that, I think the resistance in Kashmir in all its shades is, it's quite evident from that Kashmiri women are basically, they are out there and they are kind of engaging in different liberatory practices. And as I think there was a special issue which was put forward by Ather and Natasha, and some of us were contributors. And I think, as the preface said, that, the question is not whether Kashmiri women can speak, but whether you're able to hear them. So I think we need to come out of our, our very cliched understanding of Kashmir, and we need to kind of change the lens, which again, I mean, I want to kind of put it out there, which again doesn't mean that all these different subaltern layers do not exist within Kashmir. And for example, patriarchy. Yeah, that.
Thank you for that. We likely don't have a lot of time left, but there is one more question we wanted to ask before kind of wrapping up the event. So this question is more directed at Raja. What are some ways you think that the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris this year will impact American policymaking around key decisions centering Kashmir and Palestine? How do liberal Western politics differ when called to take a stand on Palestine versus Kashmir? And why is the Biden-Harris regime openly critical of Modi's repressive policies, but yet are staunch defenders of Zionists?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the problem, and of course I appreciate what Professor Ather and Uzma talked about. Their responses were spot on, and the problem here is, in majority of people who live in the West, they see the world through a Eurocentric lens, meaning that their reality, they want to project it on the rest of the world. And that's in the essence of patriarchy, the essence of gender, the essence of sexuality. The global South has a different epistemology of terms of how they deal with these issues. And I'll come back to Biden quickly. I just want to mention something really quickly, even though as a man, I prefer not to talk about this issue and let the women lead the conversation. But from a political science perspective, Frantz Fanon, who was a scholar on decolonization, in one of his books, he named a chapter called Unveiling Algeria. And his theory was that the French colonizers used to push Algerian women to remove their hijab and to try to promote empowerment of Algerian women and solidarity with the French women in order to fight Muslim men patriarchy in Algeria. Now, if France was really interested about Algerian women, they would first of all leave their land and stop killing them and killing their families. But the idea is about divide and conquer, is about forcing a different ideology on the indigenous population in order for them to fight each other and to stop this coherent resistance, popular resistance that is very entwined between the different, the males and the females and the women and the men in that society to fight together in order to free their land. So it's very essential to destroy that social comprehension and social solidarity in order for the colonization to continue there. Of course, this doesn't say that there's no patriarchy. Absolutely, whatever there's men, there's patriarchy. That's a fact. It's just that we have to talk about it from a different perspective. Now, when we talk about Biden, and I think this is also, unfortunately, and I know Abdullah mentioned something very important when he talked about something called the shock doctrine. And what's happening, unfortunately, or what happened with Trump, and Naomi Klein came up with the idea of shock doctrine, meaning that politicians wait for some natural disaster or a strong political event that takes place in order to pass in policies that cannot be passed in regular circumstances. And I feel in the concept or in the time of Trump that the liberal and democratic establishment have taken advantage of that moment in order to bring in and mobilize the dissent movement against American imperialism to bring them under the slogan of Biden. So now people who are very vocally against Obama because of his problematic and disastrous foreign policies against Palestine and different countries in the world, specifically in the global South. Now these same people are praising Biden now just because Trump was so bad, or as Americans say, not presidential, and now they're in support of Biden. When it comes to foreign policies, whether Biden or Trump or Obama, there's very little that the president himself can actually do to change, because foreign policy in this country is not done based on the mood of the president. Foreign policy here takes years of planning, years of research, years of investment, and most importantly, the Pentagon has to have spent enough time and resources to decide whether that policy is good or not for the American imperialism. American foreign policy is dictated by the concept of America as a superpower and as an empire. So Biden might change his rhetoric towards India or towards Israel, but the essence of the policies are still the same, because it's not going to change overnight, because America doesn't, it's a bureaucratic state that doesn't change by the person who's the president of the US. So I'm not very positive when it comes to, or I don't have a positive view of what Biden is going to bring. As a matter of fact, I think Biden will be more of a Obama, as like some people like Professor Hafsa call Biden as or what Obama was, a smoke screen, where Obama went to Cairo to tell the Muslim world, look at me, I'm different, I'm welcoming Muslims, but he became the liberal version of George Bush. George Bush said, you're either with us or against us. Obama came and he said, you're either a good Muslim or a bad Muslim, meaning that if you're a good Muslim, it doesn't matter about your religious aspect, your characteristics. What matters is politically, where do you stand in American empire? So I feel Biden is going to be resurfacing that. Biden will come again, and he's already doing it with Turkey, by the way. And his position in Turkey is really is dangerous so far, because it seems that America wants to go back in even though Trump was, some people accuse him of being an isolist, which is a good thing. We want America to not interfere in our countries in the global South, but now Biden is bringing in the heritage of planning coups and getting rid of democratically elected presidents in the global South, like we've been Latin America, like we've been Iran and Egypt and different countries. So I'm not too optimistic about Biden. And I think specifically when it comes to Israel, the relationship between Israel and the United States is very complex. And I'm leaning more towards the theories of Noam Chomsky, that Israel is a client state to the United States, that Israel is not only benefiting from, it's because some people accuse that the Zionist lobby in the US is controlling America's foreign policy when it comes to the Middle East, but I'm leaning more towards Noam Chomsky by saying that United States has a history of using states to be client states to do their dirty work in the region. So I don't think it's a one-way street where Israel is only benefiting from the US. I think the US is also benefiting from Israel significantly to curb the Middle East, to control the Middle East, to control the gas, to control oil, to control the political arena in the Middle East. So without the US have significant change in their political philosophy, without them having revisiting their imperialist agenda, their capitalist views around the world, I don't think the US is going to divorce Israel anytime soon, and I don't think, Israel is going to be divorcing, or the US is going to be divorcing its relations with Israel. When it comes to Kashmir, when India, I think Biden will build a better relationship with Modi, because India is very important strategically to the US now to fight China and to control that region. And specifically, when Abdullah talked about the concept of capitalism, India is very much needed now to manufacture or to have cheap labor at the expense of undermining China. So again, what I want to wrap up with saying that liberal politics within the Western Hemisphere has nothing to do with foreign policy. And that even though Biden might sound liberal, even though many of us know that he's a centralist and he's not even a liberal, their foreign policy is not going to be changed just because people voted for him because Trump was disturbing to them. I think Biden is going to just resurface the old style of winning hearts and minds, continue to destroy the world, but at the same time laugh and smile in our face and say, you know, I care about you. So I'm not too optimistic about this.
Thank you all. We went a little over time, but that's fine. So we're gonna have to wrap up, even though there were like a few more questions. So just want to thank you all individually, like Ather, Uzma, Raja, and Abdullah for joining us today. The recording of the panel will be made available after this to the RISD and Brown communities and will be posted on the event page. And we'll also send it out in emails to our listserv. So that's RISD SASA, RISD SJP, which you can be added to as well if you reached out to any of our groups here on campus. We want to invite attendees to also follow us and look out for future events and panel discussions that we're excited to hold. This is probably the last one we're going to have for this semester, seeing as finals are coming up. So thank you all.
Thank you all so much.